Ubisoft's open world games are rarely award-winning masterpieces, but they are typically some of the most fun, well-rounded and expansive games that money can buy. And for someone who likes single-player stuff, they are also a reliably good value experience. Despite this, or perhaps in part because of it, they have increasingly garnered a reputation as makers of apparently ugly, bloated and repetitive games, and people seem increasingly predisposed to hate them. For what it's worth, I do understand the reasons why people have issues with many of their individual titles. There are many Ubisoft games that I didn't personally enjoy at all, but I think that defaulting to sweeping generalizations about the quality of their output is hurting the reception and long-term reputation of some genuinely great games. I think Star Wars Outlaws, for example, is a good game, even if it obviously isn't perfect. We could sit down and spend all day nitpicking problems with a game like Outlaws, and considering those flaws without absurd biases against the game or the studio could lead to some very fruitful discussions about video games and what makes them work. But it's absurd to weaponize these generalized open world criticisms or minor weaknesses in execution in order to ridicule the game as though they noticeably impact the way it actually feels to play. A lot of faults can add up to make a game basically unplayable. But most of the issues I've seen people raise about Star Wars Outlaws are either minor quibbles or vague statements which don't account for differences in taste. I can understand people not enjoying Star Wars Outlaws when they come to play it, but I don't understand why they're not even willing to give it a chance. When did we go from trying to enjoy games despite their flaws to immediately hating them because of them? And why is it that people feel the need to actively express their hate for something that clearly just isn't to their tastes? As someone who has played most of Ubisoft's open world games throughout the years, enjoying many but equally disliking several others, I have a lot to say about the wider criticism targeted at Ubisoft. But I'd also like to use Star Wars Outlaws as an example of how they actually can do a great job of adapting their open world game design to make a fun, unique experience.
You want credits? Here, take them.
Your friend's smart. I'll be back if I notice any more errors.
The criticism leveled against Ubisoft usually comes down to two big problems as far as I can tell. These being the suggestion that their games are generally formulaic or excessively bloated. Now, if we're being totally honest, then calling Ubisoft's games formulaic is not entirely ridiculous, mostly because all open world games, to some degree, follow a formula. When a developer decides to make an open world game, they do so knowing that the player will expect that world to be filled with things and stuff to do in a very specific way. Much like any game genre, obviously, there is a blueprint that they all fit generally within. When an open world game is working as intended though, then the player shouldn't be thinking about this formula or the way that the game is structured at all. I think that when someone says Ubisoft games are formulaic, then what they really mean is that the formula is too obvious. And I do think this is true of some of their games. Basically, anytime the player starts to feel like every side activity is the same, every hub looks identical, and every quest plays out just like the rest, then the formula is showing and the blueprint is obvious. The first Assassin's Creed game, you may or may not remember, did not offer an especially good open world. Every activity felt like recycled content and exploration was not properly rewarded. It also offered up one key mechanic which would go on to define Ubisoft's open world games, as well as the problems with them. That being the synchronizing viewpoints, where you climb a tower, let the camera spin around and reveal activities on a map. Ever since then, this feature has been a mainstay of Ubisoft game design. They would reveal things in slightly different ways, and the aesthetics would be tailored to each setting, but these sync points just kept coming back, in Assassin's Creed and everywhere else. And though I don't personally hate this mechanic overall, I understand why it was increasingly criticised, because it made each new game feel to varying extents like it was just reskinning the last one, while using the same basic mechanics that have barely been iterated on. And so long as the player feels like that, then the formulaic criticism is entirely valid. Certainly, I remember feeling that way about Assassin's Creed 3, and more recently, I remember thinking that the side activities in Watch Dogs Legion's London were incredibly generic and repetitive. This criticism definitely has its roots in something very real then, not just in Ubisoft games, but in all open worlds. But it doesn't apply to every game. I don't remember ever feeling like Assassin's Creed Black Flag or Odyssey were formulaic, and I thought that Watch Dogs 2 was significantly more immersive than the first game. And then when I played Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, I was amazed by the variety of gameplay on offer. Obviously, after several iterations of numerous open world franchises, Ubisoft has a very refined workflow for creating this very specific type of game, and so the risk of them feeling formulaic is always going to be there. But the same could be said about a lot of other developers and games. Some games built within the Ubisoft framework manage to integrate their open world components into an immersive experience by tailoring every aspect to make them part of the whole, and some games don't. And the success of each game at that task is not an objective fact either. One game will work for some and not for others, and the way you feel about any associated IP will definitely affect that too.
There we go. You okay, buddy?
When people talk about modern open world games being excessively bloated, they are partly saying that they are simply too big and time consuming, and they are partly suggesting that they are, in essence, repetitive and boring. After all, someone could look at two games of the same length and say that one is bloated while everything in the other game is necessary and high quality. So calling a game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla bloated implies not only that it's a lengthy experience, but that there is too much content in there which is not worthy of players' time. And this, again, is a very valid criticism of some of Ubisoft's games, but definitely not all. And maybe more importantly, it neglects the very important fact that nobody is required to play everything inside a game, and most will very quickly get a feel for what they actually want to do inside an open world and filter out all the rest. For what it's worth, I really enjoy sinking dozens if not hundreds of hours into a big game, and when I do spend that much time with a game, it's usually because it's been designed well to slowly reveal itself, offer varied content, expand its gameplay systems, and iterate on the overall experience to keep me, the player, engaged. Not everybody wants or feels they have time for a gigantic game, but others, like myself, enjoy having a game that they can keep coming back to and chipping away at over several months. I'm a big fan of James Cameron's Avatar films and the world of Pandora in general. So unsurprisingly, I picked up Avatar Frontiers of Pandora close to release day, and I put many hours into the game in the week or so after that. Since then, though, I have been playing Frontiers of Pandora on and off for months, hopping in for an hour or three one week, taking a break for a week, and then playing a few more hours the next. And I've continued to enjoy the game immensely around playing other stuff. I think Frontiers of Pandora probably could feel bloated if I was playing a lot in a short period of time and trying to do every quest. But jumping in now and then and just seeing where the wind takes me, it's a fantastic, immersive Avatar game. When I played Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it took me 3 months to complete without really touching any other games, and it meant that I never got bored of what it actually had to offer. I'm not saying then that Ubisoft open worlds aren't enjoyable unless you spread them out, but I am suggesting that they are generally better experienced over a longer period of time. Maybe that is partly because certain content feels a bit repetitive, but whether it's by design or not, I think one of the greatest strengths of Ubisoft's open worlds is that they're easy to jump back into. There aren't dozens of complicated RPG systems to readjust to after taking a break, nor are you required to carefully manage your inventory, and normally the controls are pretty intuitive too. I wouldn't describe these games as overly simplistic, but they are easy to engage with, just like you might drop into a quick game of Call of Duty or Fortnite. It makes so much sense to me that several critics would review a game like Star Wars Outlaws poorly when given only a couple of weeks to play and digest everything that the game has to offer. I don't think the game makes a very strong first impression anyway, and that definitely matters for reviewers. My first 3 hours with the game were not especially great, and it felt like it was taking a while to get going. But when it eventually did and it all clicked together, Star Wars Outlaws definitely won me over.
Prime Sabak. Looks like it's my lucky day.
There are a lot of other Ubisoft criticisms which are more specific to individual titles in their catalogue, and can only really be addressed on a per game basis. Yes, they often have bugs, as do most big open world games, but most Ubisoft games in my experience are pretty well polished. And yes, they regularly have an in-game store offering outfits and weapons skins for ridiculous money, but it's very rarely obnoxious, and you definitely don't need these cosmetics to enjoy the game. And I agree that it's strange that facial animations in these games are getting increasingly not great. Oh, and their special editions are pretty ridiculous normally too. Ultimately, I think the most important point I can make in this discussion about Ubisoft is this. I feel like I can address the criticism levelled against Ubisoft's open world games in general, because I think that such generalised criticism is inherently flawed. But I don't feel like I can discuss the positives of their work in general, because it varies so much from game to game. Basically, lumping all of Ubisoft's stuff together with criticism is just as dumb as saying that all of their games are great. But because it's what I've been playing, and because I've seen how much unnecessary hate the game is receiving, I'd like to discuss the ways in which I think Star Wars Outlaws is actually a great game. For all the aforementioned reasons, I'm playing through Star Wars Outlaws relatively slowly, but what I have experienced of the story I have mostly greatly enjoyed. Ubisoft's open world stories have the inherent problem of needing to find a reason to split up a map and create localized story arcs. And sometimes it can feel a bit forced and, again, formulaic. But the central quest in Outlaws, requiring you to put together a team for a heist, is inherently more compelling to me than having to liberate zones or find a piece of an artifact. And better than that, I think the 4 criminal organizations in the game and their presence on each planet allows for a unique back and forth where your enemies become friends and then enemies again. Connecting the different planet maps together with some consistent elements that carry through to both the main story and the side quests. The reputation system is definitely not as fleshed out as it could be, and it is easy to manipulate once you know how. It's probably more fun if you don't do that though, and allow yourself to be hated by at least one criminal organization. Either way, Outlaws is ultimately not sold as an RPG, so I wasn't really expecting the choices between Syndicate and Cartel to dramatically affect the story. But it does add a nice dynamic element to gameplay that forces you to think more carefully about what jobs you take and how you complete them. I also think that the open world maps here are some of the best to come out of Ubisoft, and they made some great choices for a Star Wars game. Taking Canto Bight and Kijimi from the sequels and breathing new life into them is brilliant, as are Akiva and Toshara, which feel both familiar and new. And though we've seen Tatooine a million times before, they have done a great job bringing it to life here. All of these locations feel authentically Star Wars. Obviously, they look amazing, and they also feature shops and side activities and distractions, and they ultimately just feel great to walk around and soak in the atmosphere of too. Outlaws also does a great job of tailoring Ubisoft's open world systems to build a very Star Wars-y experience. You play, unsurprisingly, as an outlaw, so the quests you undertake are appropriately Han Solo-esque, and you're not overly bombarded with these quests either, oftentimes being required to listen to conversations and follow intel to find the more interesting things to do. Either that, or you're accepting a contract from a broker in a seedy cantina, which feels appropriate. Oh, and though I like BD1, and the cynic in me thinks it's kind of funny that every single player Star Wars game now requires the main character to have a cute companion, I love Nyx, and I love the way that Nyx is used in gameplay. And though I know many players are annoyed at the stealth gameplay here, I think it's a great fit. It starts off feeling pretty basic and very familiar, but it gets better and better over time, and ultimately I think it's really well adapted to offer up a particular type of Star Wars experience. If you want challenging lightsaber combat, you have the Jedi games. If you want more classic FPS combat, you have Battlefront. If you want to fight in epic space battles, there's Squadrons. But Outlaws offers a different type of Star Wars gameplay, which is probably more to my personal tastes. It's definitely not the best stealth gameplay in the world, and it's not for everybody, but it is for me and many others. Everything in the game really clicked for me during a relatively early mission where you're sent to an Imperial space station in Toshara's orbit, and have to sneak around and knock out stormtroopers on behalf of Crimson Dawn. I was immediately put in mind of where it all began for Star Wars back in 1977. Like I was sneaking around the Death Star trying to disable the tractor beam. It entirely captured that feeling for me. And equally important are the stealth adjacent mechanics, which allow you to slip into full-on combat when caught, just like in the movie. You can start trying to talk your way out of being arrested and then suddenly whip out a blaster and stun a stormtrooper. Or you can slide behind cover, start flinging thermal detonators, and pick up a stormtrooper's gun as you race towards your ship. It all extends outwards from there, I think, and there are many missions which capture the tone and action of Star Wars stories you may or may not love, from The Mandalorian to Solo, including returning characters which don't generally feel like they're just fan service. And while not every mission or activity is that strong, the game has some serious highs when every aspect of Ubisoft's open world design is melded with the Star Wars universe appropriately. It just takes understanding what the game is and meeting it on its own terms to begin with. As I said before, I've played several Ubisoft games that I didn't especially enjoy, and I've played many which I thought were good but not great. And then there are those few, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, where it feels like everything has come together to make something which is not perfect but generally awesome to play. The suggestion that every Ubisoft open world is essentially just a rewrapped version of the same game skeleton is obviously a bit silly. Some of their games are definitely bad, but some of them are genuinely fantastic. And most, I think, are at least trying something new, but aren't necessarily getting a fair shake because of Ubisoft's weird reputation. In fairness, they probably brought this on themselves by making enough games that fit the bad stereotypes that they've irreversibly damaged their image. But I still think, in the end, that every game deserves to be reviewed and played independent of such biases. And with an understanding that nobody plays such a game in quite the same way, and they all enjoy or don't enjoy different things about these open worlds. How do you feel about Star Wars Outlaws, and what would be your favourite Ubisoft open world if you had to pick? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.